So this is a Critical Perspectives podcast. Hello everyone, my name's Anthony Killick and I'm sitting here with Sarah Patton, and we're going to talk about the revolution in Rojava and what's currently taking place throughout that area, and specifically in Afrin, and then we'll go from there. So if you want to start by just telling us, what is Rojava?
It's a region in the north of Syria, and since 2012 there's been a revolution happening there. It's now an autonomous region. It hasn't declared separation from the Syrian state, but it is autonomous. So I'm just going to start from the beginning, really.
Mm-hmm.
We saw in 2011, with the Arab Spring and the start of the Syrian civil war, there's a massive process of upheaval and revolt from the peoples of various Middle Eastern and North African countries. And that kind of gave the breathing room and the space for the PYD, the kind of main Kurdish political party in Rojava, to seize areas, the Kurdish majority areas of Syria, and declare them autonomous under PYD control. So they ejected the regime, the Assad regime, and set up their own society. Kurdistan is made up of regions in Turkey, Iraq, Iran and Syria. The Kurds they're about 45 million people, largest number of people without a state, huge diaspora in Europe, America and beyond. A few years ago, a lot of people hadn't heard of them. They really came to the forefront of the world stage in 2014 in the Battle of Kobani, when you saw these ragtag fighters facing down the might of the Islamic State, and that really captured the world's imagination. And that's how a lot of people kind of got to hear about the Kurdish struggle. But there's a lot more to it than that. I was there for about 6 months, and one of my main projects was working on an English teaching project. There was a real need for this a couple of years ago. People from the revolution put out a call, and I thought, I've been working around Kurdish solidarity for a long time. This wasn't a spur of the moment decision. And I want to see what this revolution is. I want to support it in any way that I can. And I want to learn any lessons that can be learned and take back anything we can to our organising here in the UK. So my main project was an English teaching project, which I did with some other comrades, one of whom is still there. I think it's very important that we don't have these short-lived solidarity projects that just die a death. So I taught the trade unions, the diplomacy department, wounded YPJ soldiers, neighbourhood kids, and a few kind of government or revolutionary government departments. It was amazing. It was a way of really getting to see things unsupervised and unmediated and seeing very different parts of the revolution. The other project I worked on was one that kind of aimed to, as I said before, increase the uptake of the communes in the kind of more predominantly Arab and Assyrian areas. So some of that was the kind of standard door knocking, leafleting, putting on events, talking to Arab elders, trying to get them on board and talk to other people, putting on talks about, this is what the revolution can do for you, this is what we can do together. So that was really exciting to be a part of as well. It was weird how much kind of organising in the UK transplanted over that, but it was great. One thing that I do definitely realise is the privilege of being able to come back, being able to leave, and also the responsibility of what I say, how I say it, and how I talk about the revolution. I want to recognise my bias. I don't want to be one of those people who comes back and says, yeah, money doesn't exist. It exists, okay? Like, oh yeah, it's an armed dictatorship, it's a Stalinist state, it's amazing. It's not, it's not either of these things.
Nor would you want it to be.
Nor would I want it to be, but some people would.
Right.
And I recognise that responsibility, and I recognise that, I've got the privilege of being heard where many of my Kurdish comrades over there who don't speak English can't be heard in quite the same way. So yeah, I'm definitely taking that seriously. I think it's really interesting to talk about the planks of this revolution. So they said that there's 3 main planks of it, and they are that of democracy. Mm-hmm. So some kind of communalism, it's really grassroots, and it's based on a system of communes. We've got feminism. Women's liberation is kind of key to the revolution, and many people say that we can't have a free society without liberating women. And then we've got ecology, which from my experience is by far the least kind of developed part of the revolution. But there's high hopes for it, and I'll get into some of the reasons why it's not as developed as it could be now. But for the future, I think people see ecology, feminism, and democracy as the 3 key components to kind of base a revolution on.
And do these come from the writings of Öcalan, or is it?
Yeah, so Öcalan is the leading theorist of this revolution. He's been in prison since 1999 on Imrali Island, which is a small prison island he's on his own, and there's about 1,000 Turkish guards in Turkey. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how much of a threat to the Turkish state he is. One guy surrounded by 1,000 guards on an island away from the rest of the country. Öcalan's the head of the PKK, which some people may have heard of, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And he's also kind of the ideologue of the YPG and YPJ and of the PYD. His kind of ideology has changed over the last few decades. It kind of went from a classic Marxist-Leninist liberation struggle, national liberation struggle, to something that's quite different. The main goal used to be seeking an independent Kurdistan, a state of Kurdistan, and it's gone away from kind of from the aim being declaring your own country, to somewhat of a more federalised system that's a bit more porous and maybe a little bit more difficult to define, but it's definitely multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and it's no longer just a Kurdish struggle. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, number about 50,000 people, and without them, ISIS couldn't have been defeated. And the YPG and J, who were the kind of militias of Rojava, were leading that fight. The US was supporting the Kurds militarily, particularly at the start of January 2017. Trump gave them quite a lot of heavy weaponry, of guns, things like that, and supported them with airstrikes, which the Kurds ordered. But there's a varied kind of multi-ethnic population in Rojava. So there's Arabs, Assyrians, Chechens, Kurdish people.
And all of these people are living under the sort of banner of the YPG? Okay,
so I guess what's interesting there is that the YPG is a militia, it's not a party. Mm-hmm. So the PYD is the party.
Right.
They're not all living under the banner of the PYD. In fact, the city that I was mainly based in, Qamislo, was split between the Assad regime and the revolution. Which is quite strange. There's roadblocks in various places. You could mostly walk around, but it was split, and the Assad regime kept a little bit of the city. This was kind of mostly tactical because that part of the city was where the airport was. And the revolution doesn't have planes, so it's kind of handy to keep that airport and that kind of tentative truce so that every now and again they can use it. One thing that's happened over the last few years is a real big campaign and initiative to try and increase the uptake of the revolution, mainly through the communes. So there's a commune on every street or 2 streets. They serve about 100 families each. And in the majority Arab areas, at first people weren't kind of taking part because, they thought, this is a Kurdish revolution, this isn't for me. And maybe in the Assyrian and Chechen and Turkmen areas, there was a bit more uptake because there'd been a kind of consistent repression of minorities, particularly the Kurds. It was illegal to speak Kurdish, it was illegal to have a Kurdish name, but also of other minorities. So it's important to say that there's been a huge increase in the amount of other ethnicities taking part in the communes, but also in the higher up structures. So the co-chairs for the region I was living in were an Arab man and a Kurdish woman. And they kind of say that if there's one ethnic minority in a city, he's going to be represented on the highest council. They almost disproportionately represent minorities so that what was happening under Assad's regime doesn't happen again.
It seems what we're seeing here, given all of the politics that you're talking about and the way that they're being put into practice, and the three planks that you mentioned of democracy, ecology and feminism being derived from the theories of Öcalan and materialising in that specific geographical location, despite the bombardment that these people are under from various different places, and despite the fact that they're having to fight a war, and despite the fact now they're being bombarded by Turkey in Afrin.
With regards to Turkey bombing Afrin, the kind of largest population of Kurds live in Turkey, in Baku, northern Kurdistan. And it's a real threat to Turkey to see this revolution taking place, because it worries that this will inspire the Kurds over the border in Turkey, who I think we're probably getting up to about the anniversary of this, but who declared autonomy a few years ago. And under this system of democratic confederalism, this commune, feminist, ecological system. And I mean, basically, Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, just committed a genocide, a merciless genocide against them. We've lost an entire generation of political activists. And then after the coup in 2016, summer 2016, we've seen unprecedented amounts of journalists, academics and activists locked away, sometimes barely without trial, sometimes just disappearing. There's a few things going on there. It's not in Turkey's interests for the Kurds to get a stronger position. Last week was the first time they'd been invited to the Syrian peace talks by the Russians, and they actually refused to go because of the lack of international support after Turkey's bombardment of Afrin. But I think it was interesting timing, because it was just before those peace talks were supposed to begin, and theoretically, if you destroy the region, you then maybe massively weaken the PYD's position at those talks. The other thing is that Erdogan he's always had a popular base, right? So I think a lot of us in the West, we see Erdogan as this kind of monstrous figure. We see the things that he's doing and the things that he's saying, and we don't agree with it. But actually there's a massively popular base, and although he's the leader of a secular party, there's a religious element to that. The coup in 2016 for sure shored up his support. At the moment, we're seeing a huge economic downturn. So bread, vegetables have all just gone so high in price. So people are losing support. And the best way to kind of regain your support base is sometimes to declare war on a common enemy and show how well you're doing.
This is a common thing. It sort of reminds me of Thatcher, Falklands.
Yeah, right.
Everything's going wrong. Nobody's going to vote for me again, potentially. Mm-hmm. If I start a war and blame someone else, focus everyone's attention on our supposed common enemy, that improves my election chances. And I heard that Turkey, actually, there's a good chance they will have an election in 2018 or 2019.
2019, yeah. It took an embarrassingly long time for the Syrian government to come out against Turkey's invasion, and that was definitely a measured and calculated approach. I think they thought that within a couple of days, Turkey said that within a couple of days Afrin would be crushed. They're kind of framing this, by the way, as an anti-terror attack, which makes no sense because the people there are civilians that they're killing, and you've got to ask who the actual terrorist here is.
And of course, that's another justification for bombing anyone, is just to say they're terrorists.
Yeah, exactly. It's also part of Erdogan's kind of like new Ottoman Empire ideas. The YPG&J have some kind of anti-aircraft missiles, maybe captured from Daesh, maybe from the US, and the Turkish troops are in German-made Leopard 2 tanks. It's crazy. You've got the second largest army in NATO going up against this very small kind of ad hoc force, and they're not winning. It's been more than 2 weeks now, and it hasn't been easy. There's been mass casualties, and
on both sides.
On both sides, but they're attacking grandmothers with guns in some places, and they're losing.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, one point I would say on that as well that is really important to bring up is that it's not just the Turkish army invading Afrin. They're allied with the FSA, the Free Syrian Army.
Yes.
And a lot of those remaining in the FSA in these areas are kind of, I guess, directionless militias, some extreme Islamists, some remnants of al-Nusra, even some remnants of Daesh. One thing that's happened over the last day or so is you've seen thousands and thousands of people from all the other areas of Rojava walking or driving or, however they can make it there. They've all gone to Afrin. People are lining the streets of Afrin to defend it. Thousands of people. This isn't like, maybe you think about war and you think about refugees running away. These people are running towards the war, and it's not because they want to run towards the war. It's because they're seeing the urgency of what's happening right now and the fact that this revolution is being attacked. We've had the Iraqi government said that it's an illegal incursion. The Syrian government's now said, this is an illegal incursion. We'll treat it as such. In fact, there was a clash between Syrian and Turkish forces, which seems to have been mediated and resolved by Russian forces. Interesting. America has given a very weak kind of Turkey should pull back statement. France has appealed to the UN. I mean, these are all very weak statements, but even weaker is the absolute silence of the British government, and in fact the tweet by our Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson supporting Turkey and supporting Turkey's anti-terror actions is absolutely reprehensible, and I think it shows the kind of leadership that we have.
Not acknowledging that Turkey was one of the main enablers of ISIS by not stopping them to get through in certain areas where they could have stopped them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's documented. That's documented that they did that.
Why the YPG is actually one, and the YPJ are probably the primary force in defeating them, and this is the kind of treatment that they get afterwards. So,
I mean, I think the Kurds have always been somewhat of a political football, and there are some leftists that criticise them because they say, you're allied with the US, I'm anti-imperialist, so I can't support this. And I mean, I just don't agree with that at all. I think you've got a very small revolution. You're protecting and trying to build a very small, in a very small area of land with not many resources available to you. Embargoes on all sides. And I think the line there is very much, okay, we're being used by America, but we're going to use them back. It's by no means, no one's singing the Stars and Stripes,
So I saw a talk you gave the other day, and you talked about how the revolution in Rojava is being built. How is it being built?
Okay, so I think this is a really important thing to talk about, actually. As I said before, 100% of the people didn't, jump up one day and say, I want democratic confederalism, I want Öcalan on my wall kind of thing. So what's happening is there's several strands to it. The first one, we've got ideology. We've got this idea of the democratic nation, of multi-ethnic, multi-religious cooperation and, peaceful coexistence. We've also got the feminism, which is a really strong strand. There's a thing called genealogy, which roughly translates to the science of women. Genealogy kind of tells the history of 5,000 years of patriarchy. And it's a creation of Öcalan's, and the main point of it is to say we can't have a life without capitalism, we can't have a free society until the women are free. And so this then leads on to some legal points. So we've got 40% of every council committee must be of either gender. And that's important. We're not just saying it must be 40% women, we're saying 40% of either gender. So that in some of the more traditionally feminized aspects of politics or of domestic life, the men can't avoid it. They also have to contribute and discuss and listen.
Because the men would try to get away from certain posts or certain jobs.
Yeah,
so the 40% thing is the idea that you have to go and do this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, some people would, for sure. And then we've got, for every position of authority, from the communes right up to the leaders of the PYD, has a male and female co-chair. And that's really important because you've got women who were previously housewives or, whatever, are now in leading positions of government, and you're seeing women leading in every part of life, not just the army. You've got that traditional kind of newspaper picture of the beautiful woman with a gun on her back. It's not just that. The revolution's coming right back from the front lines into society. And then we've got education and training. The other thing that is legal as well is divorce is legal. Polygamy is illegal. These make massive, tangible differences in people's lives. Since 2012, we've seen the amount of people getting divorced every year just increase by the year. In the first year, there was about 100. Now there's about 800 or 900 a year. We hope this is women leaving unhappy marriages, leaving abusive marriages, and realising that they can be independent. So I've mentioned ideology, I've mentioned legal changes, and that kind of leads me on to the education and training strand. So there's very much a recognition that you can't just say, okay, you were a housewife 5 years ago and now you're going to lead the country, kind of thing, or lead the region. There's a massive emphasis on training women, both kind of giving them the education that they might not have had access to before, and giving them the skills to be able to speak, to empower them and to enable them to empower themselves. There's also a lot of training for men to train them to listen and to realise, the faults of patriarchy and the need for a more egalitarian society. So that's education. And then we can go onto another strand. And as I said before, this is very complex. There's a few layers to it, but the next strand I'd say would be materially. Because not everyone's political, right? You go into a room and you say, yes, socialism right now. And, at least a few people in that room are going to be like, I don't care about politics. Politics is boring. And okay, maybe politics is a bit more tangible in the Middle East where, it can be life or death at the moment. I mean, I'm not saying that as an orientalized kind of expression. Like, the last few years, it has been life or death. But still, there's always going to be people who don't care. There's also always going to be people who are actively against you. Like, that's just how it works. I spoke to quite a lot of people who said, I don't support this revolution. I love neoliberalism. I love capitalism. That they're the best ways for a society to be free. And, I don't agree with that. Most people there don't agree with that. But how do you make them agree? So this is how we get onto materially. At the communes, if you go to your local commune, all the communes subsidise bread and oil. And that's important, okay? So you can have very, very cheap bread. Rojava used to be called the breadbasket of Syria. It produced about 65% of Syria's wheat. So you can have very cheap bread. There's also very cheap oil, as in not cooking oil, the oil for heating your burners and stuff like that and cooking. Rojava's oil rich, although the embargoes mean that it's not always possible to refine or extract everything. But
also means most of that bread goes wasted, doesn't it?
Well, yes and no. I think you're not trading as much bread as you were before, but it does enable you to give away a lot of free and cheap bread, which means that people are better fed and they have more oil. And these are very material, differences that you can make in someone's life that just actually changes their mind a little bit, or makes them agree with the revolution. You've got to say, you can't just say, we've got this great way of living, isn't it great? You've got to say, we've got this great way of living. Look, you're safer, you're not hungry, you're living, objectively a nice life.
And of course you're going to get various different religious groups who are more able to live with each other under those conditions, because everyone's able to live well, then why fight with each other? So scarcity breeds those kinds of conflicts.
Absolutely. Obviously it's still difficult to get some food items in. There's embargoes on all sides. It's very difficult. The borders are somewhat porous, but not enough to make a full kind of supermarket logistics system type thing. The other material thing, though, I'd say is security. There's a few different layers of security, and one of the ones I like the most are the HPC, and they're like the neighbourhood voluntary force, and each commune has to elect a few, and they're answerable to the commune, so they're almost seen as the last line of resistance of the revolution,
Well, they like the police.
Yeah, they're like police, but not answerable to a state or a government, but to the people, and they're voluntary. And the kind of trope, the ones you'll most often see are these very small, very terrifying old ladies in vests and Kalashnikovs sauntering around and giving you the eye, and it's just, they're incredible. I did a project while I was there, which was trying to link the women's struggle in Rojava with the strike for the 8th, strike for repeal campaign in Ireland, and I was what
is that?
Which is pro-choice, against the kind of draconian abortion laws that they have in Ireland.
Okay, so the linking of those two struggles.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that people see for the revolution is the use of an internationalist is to broaden the struggle, to link it to other things, and to try and show that this isn't just a revolution that's happening somewhere over there, but this is more than, a revolution in a place. It's a revolution. I explained that badly, but so I tried to get an old lady to hold up my little strike for repeal the 8th poster that I'd made, and she said, I can't do this without my Kalashnikov, and she made me wait and went off and grabbed her Kalashnikov and put it over the sign and looked incredibly pleased with herself. I can send you the picture, it's incredible. And I just said, okay, thank you. And then the last one I'd say is through day-to-day life. So I'd say, if you think of the communes, you have a meeting there every 2 weeks, but there's lots of education sessions, and there's a few different commissions on things like justice, women, politics, all these happening in the communes and then feeding up to the higher structures of the revolution. So if you think of the communes as almost a transmission belt of the revolution, you might come in there to get your subsidised bread and oil, but you'll hear some of the politics that are being discussed. You'll see some of the things that are happening. You'll have the chance to criticise and talk about the revolution, the theory, and just day-to-day life as well. And the people from higher up often come to the local communes and answer everyone's criticisms and kind of, talk to them about it. The other day-to-day thing, I guess, would be the comrades. So you've got the kind of cadre of the party who every day, after a full day of work, every night, they'll go to a different family's house and they'll sit there for hours. They'll sit there for hours and hours and hours saying, okay, what are your criticisms? What do you like? What don't you like? Okay, how can we make life better for you, kind of thing. And it's exhausting and incredible. And I think one thing that I've learned from this revolution is just the sheer amount of discipline and commitment that's needed to really build something and really make everyone feel like their voices are being heard. But
yeah, I read about those cadres in the Revolution in Rojava book. They are extremely dedicated, it would seem, that they sort of pledged to give up everything from, down to individual relationships and just commit themselves to the revolution. It's Pretty crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So one interesting thing there is I've spoken to people who are very much against the revolution, but saw the sheer amount of commitment that these people are putting in. And they say, I don't support the revolution, but I respect the comrades because they're not getting fat off this, Like, we've had bosses who get fat off our work, off ruling us, and they're not ruling, we can see they're not ruling. But these guys, they're not getting fat off us. If anything, they're getting very skinny and very tired. One important thing is that the comrades never eat better than the people. So whilst I was there, I ate mainly rice and got pretty malnourished. Mainly rice and lentils and, the odd bit of vegetable. But that's a really important part of it as well, And I think that's just amazing. They've got these people who have severe, real ideological differences, but they still respect the people they disagree with, and
And these disagreements are fleshed out through councils and education, and
yeah, it's also not a one-party system. There's a few different parties. Recently, we had elections. The PYD, the main party, won about 88% of the vote, but that's because they're the best.
And those debates are ongoing, right?
Yeah, the debates are ongoing. There's a coalition of rival parties called ENKS, and they kind of go off the more Kurdish region of Iraq, kind of neoliberal governance aspirations.
Would the Free Syrian Army perhaps be attempting to tap into these kinds of different political parties in some way, or would these different political parties have that kind of disagreement amongst themselves and with the PYD, but also the understanding that these fuckers would be even worse?
Yeah, I mean, they're not a party, are they? You can see in these videos, there was one published today of the FSA militants just beating up an old Syrian man, and people don't see these people as a viable alternative. They see them as hoodlums. One of the names for them, which I kind of roughly translate as gangster. You also see that they're often shouting kind of, Islamist war cries. And people have had enough of the Islamic State. Often people say, they're interchangeable,
The Free Syrian Army and the Islamic State are interchangeable.
No, I'm not saying that, but some people might think that,
because of their actions and the things that they say.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. What has been the reaction of the British state to volunteers coming back from the area, having fought ISIS for all that time?
Excellent question. So there's a bit of a history for the last few years of people coming home, and it's quite interesting because there's no solid law around it, so it's often up to the area that you're from. So for example, there was someone in Nottingham, I think he ended up on bail for a few months. There's someone in kind of Bristol area, and he ended up in about a 7-month trial on terror charges.
Yeah, The Intercept did a story about him, I think.
Yeah, so other people have kind of come home and got away scot-free, but there's kind of some interesting things to pull out there, because there are some people who come from slightly a more right-wing kind of place, and often it's the left-wing activists who have been over who kind of get taken aside, and the people who are a bit more central Tory leaning don't as much. But it's also up to the area that people are from. There's a think tank in London called the Henry Jackson Society, and they've been kind of putting pressure on the government and trying to paint this narrative that all people who come back from there, no matter what they've been doing, should be charged and should face a prison sentence, which I obviously have vested interest in that not happening. I was in Rojava for about 6 months, and I was doing mainly civil work, but the Henry Jackson Society would also see anyone coming back from that region as a threat, which you have to think, why? Why is that happening? I think one thing that is really important that we do is when foreign volunteers come back and they're facing charges, that we support them and we show them that this is very much an internationalist revolution and we support our internationalist comrades for joining the struggle.
People talk about the need to build, something approaching a utopia, and it seems to me that what's happening there now is the closest approximation to that being realised or potentially realised. One of the things it says in the Revolution in Rojava book is that the Middle East is not fully under the yoke of capitalism yet, and this struggle just goes to show that even more, I would say, and the possibilities there for a very thoroughgoing egalitarian leftist society are very real, and that needs to be supported by leftists the world over, otherwise it isn't going to materialise.
If you're interested in the Kurdish struggle, if you're interested in the revolution that's happening in Rojava, now's the time that if you haven't spoken up before, you should be speaking up. Again, Turkey's illegally invaded Afrin. Hundreds of civilians have either died or been injured. And now's the time that we should be showing solidarity with them, because we can't take for granted that this revolution is still going to exist in a few years. I mean, I have hope. I have incredible amounts of hope, but, now's the time. So I'd say organise. And if you can't organise, demonstrate. And if you can't demonstrate, donate. There's amazing charities like Qamislo, the Kurdish Red Crescent, which is providing on-the-ground medical support constantly. There's also an incredible campaign by Secours Rouge in Europe that is raising money for medical supplies for the female fighters of Rojava and Shingal. And if you can't donate, write letters, do anything, raise awareness. It's important and it's happening now, and it's not, a world away. If you're a leftist, this is our struggle too.
Sarah Patton, thanks very much.
Thanks.